November 1944. A cold morning in Tennessee. A young German woman walked into an American military examination room. She was thin, silent, afraid. The medic asked her simple questions. "Do you have pain? Any injuries? Anything I should know?" She shook her head. No. But her body told a different story. The way she moved, the way she sat, the way she flinched when he touched her shoulder. Then she finally spoke. Just 5 words, barely a whisper. "It hurts when I sit." Those words unlocked a horror that made this American medic weep openly. What he found hidden beneath her clothes was not just injury. It was a map of systematic torture. And the people who did this to her were not Americans. They were her own countrymen.
Don't hurt me.
But here's what nobody expected.
Hannelore,
What happened next between this enemy
happened.
prisoner and her American captor would become one of the most powerful stories of compassion to emerge from World War II. Watch this full story. I promise you will not forget it. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, but it helps us more than you know. Let us begin. Leland Carraway arrived at Camp Forest, Tennessee in late October 1944 with a belief that most of his fellow soldiers thought was naive, perhaps even dangerous. He believed that enemy prisoners deserved the same medical care as American troops, not because it was required by the Geneva Convention, though it was, not because it might win the war, though compassion sometimes did what bullets could not, but because Leland believed that suffering erased the lines drawn on maps, that pain spoke a language older than nationalism, and that a medic who chose his patients based on their uniform had abandoned the very oath he swore to uphold. He was 28 years old, tall and thin, with hands that trembled slightly when he was nervous, but steadied the moment they touched a wound. He had grown up in rural Virginia, the son of a country doctor who had taught him that healing was not a profession, but a calling, and that the worst sin a medical man could commit was to look at a human being and see only an enemy, only a new number, only a problem to be processed and forgotten. Camp Forest itself sprawled across more than 85,000 acres of Tennessee woodland and open field. It had been built rapidly in 1941 as America prepared for war, and it showed the signs of hasty construction everywhere. Barracks that leaked when it rained, medical facilities that were functional but far from modern, supply systems that worked most of the time but occasionally failed in ways that required improvisation and creativity. By November 1944, the camp held over 12,000 prisoners of war, mostly German and Italian soldiers captured in North Africa and Europe, men who had been shipped across the Atlantic, in crowded transport ships, and deposited into the American heartland, far from the battlefields where they had fought. But the women were different. Female prisoners of war were rare, complicated, and the camp administration had been preparing for weeks for their arrival. Special barracks had been designated, female guards had been requested, though not enough had arrived. Medical protocols had been written and rewritten as officers tried to anticipate needs they had never encountered before. Leland had volunteered specifically for this assignment when he heard about it. His commanding officer, a gruff captain named Vickers, had looked at him with open suspicion. "You understand, these are Germans, Carraway. Women who served the Nazi war machine. They're not victims. They're enemies." Leland had met his gaze without flinching. "They're patients, sir, and if they're wounded or sick, they're my responsibility." Vickers had approved the assignment, but his expression suggested he thought Leland was too soft for military medicine, too idealistic for the real work of war. Perhaps he was right. But Leland had seen enough suffering in the past 3 years, had treated enough shattered bodies and traumatized minds to know that cruelty was easy and compassion was hard, that the hard things were usually the ones worth doing. The night before the women were scheduled to arrive, Leland walked through the medical facility, checking supplies, preparing examination rooms, making lists of what he would. need. The air was cold, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the barrack stoves and the sharper smell of disinfectant from the freshly scrubbed floors. He could hear the distant sounds of the main camp, guards calling to each other, trucks rumbling past, the low murmur of thousands of men confined behind barbed wire. He thought about what these women might have experienced. The war in Europe had become a grinding nightmare of bombing raids and collapsing armies. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Millions of people had been displaced, starved, killed. The Nazi regime, facing defeat, had grown more desperate and more brutal. And the women who had served that regime in whatever capacity, as clerks, as radio operators, as nurses, as auxiliaries, had likely witnessed horrors that would mark them for life. Leland had studied some German in preparation, using a battered phrasebook and practicing with a German-American translator at the camp. His accent was terrible, his grammar uncertain, but he could ask basic medical questions and understand simple answers. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was an effort, and he believed that effort mattered. When the transport trucks finally rolled through the gates the next morning, November 14, 1944, Leland stood outside the medical building and watched the women climb down. There were 43 of them in this first group. They looked exhausted, frightened, and painfully thin. They wore a mixture of worn civilian clothes and pieces of military uniforms. Some carried small bags. Most carried nothing at all. What struck Leland most was their silence. These women did not speak to each other, did not look at the guards, did not react to the commands shouted in English and broken German. They simply moved through the processing with the blank efficiency of Tifeto people who had learned that compliance was survival, that invisibility was safety, that hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. And Leland understood, watching them, that his real work was about to begin. The medical examinations began on the second day. After the women had been processed, photographed, assigned identification numbers, and given prison uniforms that were often too large or too small because the camp had not anticipated the range of sizes needed for female prisoners. Leland set up a rotation system, seeing patients one at a time in a small examination room that had been hastily converted from a storage closet. It had a wooden table, a single chair, a cabinet containing basic medical supplies, and a window that looked out onto the bare November trees. The first dozen women he examined showed the predictable signs of wartime deprivation. Malnutrition was nearly universal. Their bodies carried the evidence of months or years without adequate food, with visible ribs, hollow cheeks, and a general thinness that suggested their bodies had begun consuming themselves for fuel. Several had respiratory infections from exposure to cold and damp conditions. Others had dental problems, skin conditions, and the kind of minor injuries that had been left untreated until they became major complications. Leland documented everything carefully, prescribed what treatments he could with the limited supplies available, and referred the more serious cases to the camp physician, Dr. Oswin Carmody, a white-haired veteran of the First World War who had seen enough suffering to fill several lifetimes. But on the afternoon of the second day, November 15th, a young woman was brought to his examination room who was different from the others in ways that Leland could not immediately name, but could absolutely feel. Her identification card listed her as Hannelore Seidel, age 23, former clerk and radio operator at a coastal defense installation near Rostock. She had been captured by British forces in May 1944 and transferred through several POW camps before being selected for transport to America. The moment she entered the room, Leland noticed the stiffness in her movements, as if her body were made of something more fragile than bone and muscle, something that might shatter if she moved too quickly or bent in the wrong direction. She walked with careful, measured steps, keeping her spine unnaturally straight, and when she sat down on the examination table at his gesture, she did so slowly, with visible hesitation, and then shifted her weight immediately, as if the position caused her discomfort. Her eyes never met his, not once. She stared at the floor with such intensity that Leland found himself glancing to see if there was something written there, some message that only she could read. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white with pressure, and her breathing was shallow and controlled, like someone who had learned to make herself as small and quiet as possible. Leland spoke to her in his halting German, introducing himself, explaining that he was going to perform a basic medical examination, asking her if she understood. Hannelore nodded once, a tiny movement of her head, but said nothing. Her silence was not the simple quiet of shyness or language barrier. It was something deeper, more deliberate, a silence that felt like a wall built brick by brick to keep the world out and her secrets in. He asked her the standard questions. Did she have any pain? Any injuries? Any medical problems he should know about? To each question, Hannelore responded with either a small shake of her head or a barely audible 9 that seemed to cost her enormous effort to produce. Her voice, when it came, was rough and unused, like a door hinge that had rusted from lack of movement. But Leland had been trained to observe, and observation was revealing things that Hannelore's words were trying to hide. When he asked her to take a deep breath so he could listen to her lungs, she complied, but he noticed the way she winced slightly, the way her left shoulder seemed to lock when she tried to expand her chest fully. When he gently touched her shoulder blade to position his stethoscope, she went rigid, her entire body tensing like an animal expecting a blow. "Does this hurt?" Leland asked in German, keeping his voice soft, keeping his hands light and visible. Another headshake, but her face told a different story. A muscle in her jaw twitched. Her breathing had become even more shallow, and when Leland pressed gently on the shoulder joint itself, asking her to move her arm forward and back, the movement was restricted, painful, and accompanied by a sound she could not quite suppress, a small intake of breath that spoke of agony being carefully managed and deliberately hidden. According to the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were required to receive medical care equivalent to that provided to the captor nation's own forces. In practice, this meant that Leland had both the authority and the obligation to conduct thorough examinations, to document all injuries, to provide treatment. But he also understood that authority meant nothing to someone who had learned to fear it, that obligation could not override the deep human instinct to protect oneself by hiding. Vulnerability. He stepped back, giving Hannelore space, and spoke to her again in his careful German. "I am here to help you. You are safe now. If you are injured, I need to know so I can treat you properly." For the first time, Hannelore's eyes flickered up to meet his, just for a moment, just long enough for Leland to see what lived behind them. Fear, yes, but also something else. Something that looked like the terrible weight of a secret too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to share. Then her gaze dropped again to the floor, and the wall rebuilt itself, and the silence returned, thicker than before. Leland made a decision in that moment that would change everything that followed. He could have simply noted in Hannelore's file that she appeared healthy enough, that she showed signs of malnutrition like the others, and moved on to the next patient in the long line of women waiting to be examined. He could have accepted her silence as an answer, her denials as truth, her carefully constructed wall as something too solid to breach. But something in that brief moment of eye contact had communicated a plea that her words could not or would not speak, and Leland had spent too many years learning to read the language of suffering to ignore it now. "I need to examine your shoulder more carefully," he said in German, speaking slowly so she could understand each word. "I believe you have an injury there. It may be serious. I cannot help you if I do not know what is wrong." Hannelore's hands tightened in her lap. For a long moment, she did not move, did not speak, did not even seem to breathe. The examination room was so quiet that Leland could hear the wind moving through the bare branches outside the window, could hear the distant sound of guards shouting commands in. The yard could hear his own heartbeat pulsing in his ears as he waited for her to make a choice between continued silence and the terrifying vulnerability of truth. Finally, in a voice so quiet that Leland had to lean forward to hear it, Hannelore spoke. Not in mangled words this time, but in a sentence that seemed to tear itself from her throat with physical effort. Es tut weh when ich sitz. It hurts when I sit. The words hung in the air between them, and Leland felt something shift in his understanding. A shoulder injury that caused pain when sitting suggested damage that extended beyond the joint itself, suggested trauma to the back, to the spine, to the musculature that then connected the shoulder to the rest of the body. It suggested an injury that had been severe, that had been inflicted with force, and that had never been properly treated. "Can you show me?" Leland asked, keeping his voice gentle, keeping his movement slow and non-threatening, aware that he was asking her to cross a boundary that she had fought. Hard to maintain. Another long silence. Then, with trembling hands, Hannelore reached for the collar of her prison uniform shirt and slowly, painfully, pulled it down to expose her left shoulder and upper back. What Leland saw made his professional composure falter. The shoulder blade was misshapen, sitting at an angle that was not anatomically correct, suggesting that the bone had been broken and had healed improperly without medical intervention. The surrounding skin was marked with scars, long thin lines that had the distinctive appearance of wounds made by something sharp and deliberately applied, wounds that had been inflicted multiple times over an extended period. But it was the bruising that made Leland's breath catch. Even weeks after the original injury, the discoloration was still visible, a sickly yellow-green stain that spread across her shoulder and down her back, marking the ghost of violence that had been catastrophic in its force. Based on what he could see, Leland estimated that her shoulder had been struck with something heavy, a rifle butt, a club, perhaps a boot, with enough force to fracture the scapula and damage the surrounding tissue so severely that sitting upright compressed the injured area against the chair, causing the pain she had finally admitted to feeling. "Who did this to you?" Leland asked, though he already suspected the answer. Hannelore's voice, when it came, was flat and emotionless, as if she were reporting on something that had happened to someone else, in some other life, in some other world. "Ein Wachmann, a guard, at the labor camp where I was sent before the coastal station." "When did this happen?" March of this year, 8 months ago." 8 months she had carried this injury without treatment, without care, without even acknowledgement. 8 months of pain every time she sat down, every time she moved her arm, every time she tried to sleep. 8 months of keeping this secret because speaking about it might have invited more violence, more punishment, more attention from guards who saw prisoners not as human beings, but as objects to be used and discarded. According to records that would later be compiled by Allied investigators, more than 27,000 women passed through the Nazi labor camp system during the war years, serving in various capacities that ranged from clerical work to ammunition production to forced labor in factories and farms. The treatment of these women varied widely depending on the camp, the guards, and the political climate, but reports consistently documented systematic abuse, inadequate medical care, and a culture of violence that was both casual and catastrophic. Leland examined the shoulder as gently as he could, but even his careful touch caused Hannelore to flinch, caused her breathing to become rapid and shallow, caused tears to form at the corners of her eyes, though she did not let them fall. The joint had limited range of motion. The bone had fused incorrectly. The damage was permanent in some ways, though with proper treatment, some function might be restored. Some pain might be reduced. "Why did he do this?" Leland asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Hannelore's response came in a whisper. "I was too slow. I did not move fast enough when he gave an order, so he taught me to move faster." The clinical description of such brutal pedagogy made something crack in Leland's chest, made his hands shake as he reached for his notepad to document the injury, made him understand that what he was witnessing was not just one woman's suffering, but a glimpse into a system of cruelty that had operated with official sanction and without meaningful oversight. And he understood, too, that if Hannelore had hidden a scene in an injury this severe, there were likely others she had not yet revealed. Leland set down his notepad and looked at Hannelore with the kind of careful attention that a medic learns to develop when words are not enough, when the truth must be coaxed out, through patience and trust rather than demanded through authority. He had found one injury, severe and hidden, and his instincts told him that a person who had concealed damage this serious was likely concealing more. The human body, when subjected to systematic violence, carries the evidence in layers, and those layers tell a story that victims often cannot or will not speak aloud. "Hannelore," he said softly, using her first name for the first time, hoping that the informality might help dissolve some of the distance between them. "Are there other injuries? Other places where you're hurt?" The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This one felt like a decision made, like a door being slowly opened after years of being locked, like a dam beginning to crack under the pressure of water that had been held back too long. Hannelore's hands moved to the buttons of her shirt, trembling so violently that she struggled to unfasten them, and Leland had to resist the urge to help her, because he understood that this had to be her choice, her action, her decision to reveal what she had kept hidden. When she finally pulled the shirt open and lifted the undershirt beneath, exposing her torso to the harsh electric light of the examination room, Leland felt the floor seem to shift beneath his feet, felt his breath stop in his chest, felt every piece of medical training and professional distance collapse in the face of what he was seeing. Her body was a map of brutality. Long scars crisscrossed her back and sides, some old and faded to white, others more recent and still raised and pink. Scars that had the distinctive pattern of being made by something sharp and flexible, a whip, a belt, perhaps a length of shuttle or wire. There were burn marks on her ribs, circular and deliberate, suggesting cigarettes or heated metal applied to skin. And there were bruises in various stages of healing, from fresh purple-black marks to older ones that had turned green and yellow, bruises that formed patterns suggesting boots, fists, and the systematic application of violence over weeks or months. But worse than the visible injuries were the signs of what had been done to her internally. Her ribcage was grotesquely visible, each bone defined beneath skin that had lost almost all its fat, suggesting malnutrition so severe that it bordered on starvation. According to medical standards established by the International Red Cross in 1944, the minimum caloric intake for an adult female performing light labors was 2,000 calories per day. Leland estimated, based on Hannelore's condition, that she had been receiving perhaps half that amount for months, possibly less. There were also signs of infection. Several of the scars showed the redness and swelling that indicated they had never healed properly, that bacteria had taken hold in wounds that had been left untreated, that her body had been fighting a battle against sepsis without antibiotics or proper care. One particularly large scar across her lower back was weeping a clear fluid, infected and dangerous, the kind of wound that could kill if left unattended much longer. Leland felt tears begin to form in his eyes, felt them spill over despite his efforts to maintain his composure, felt them run down his cheeks as he stood there looking at the sazonupta, evidence of systematic torture inflicted on a young woman whose only crime had been to exist in the wrong place at the wrong time under the wrong regime. He turned away for a moment, wiping his face with the back of his hand, ashamed of his emotional response but unable to stop it, unable to look at this suffering and remain clinically detached. When he turned back, he found Hannelore watching him with an expression of confusion and something that might have been fear. She was not accustomed to seeing her pain reflected in another person's face, not accustomed to having her injuries treated as something worthy of grief rather than indifference or contempt. "Where did this happen?" Leland asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Stutthof," Hannelore said quietly. "I was there for 7 months before they transferred me to the coastal facility." Leland knew the name. Stutthof had been one of the first concentration camps established by the Nazi regime, located near Danzig, and it had held tens of thousands of prisoners over the years. Political dissidents, Polish resistance fighters, Jews, and later, women who were deemed useful for labor war who had committed infractions against military discipline. The camp had a documented mortality rate of approximately 65,000 deaths out of 110,000 prisoners who passed through its gates between 1939 and 1945. Those who survived often carried injuries like the ones Hannelore was now revealing. "The guards there," Hannelore continued, her voice flat and emotionless again. "They did not need reasons. Sometimes they beat us because we were slow. Sometimes because we looked at them wrong. Sometimes because they were bored, and we were there. The casualness of the violence, the bureaucratic normalization of torture, the complete absence of accountability, these were the features of a system that had abandoned any pretense of human decency, that had given ordinary men extraordinary power and encouraged them to use it without mercy or restraint." Leland reached for his medical bag with shaking hands, pulling out antiseptic, bandages, and the limited antibiotics he had available. He would treat these wounds. He would document every injury. He would make sure that someone, somewhere, knew what had been done to this woman, and he would make certain that it would never happen to her again. The weeks that followed were a slow journey from darkness towards something that resembled light. Leland referred Hannelore to Dr. Oswin Carmody for comprehensive treatment of her more serious injuries, and together they developed a care plan that addressed both her immediate medical needs and the longer-term damage that years of abuse and malnutrition had caused. The infected wound on her lower back required daily cleaning and antibiotics, which were in limited supply, but which Carmody authorized without hesitation after seeing the extent of her injuries. The malformed shoulder blade could not be fully corrected without surgery that was beyond the camp's capabilities, but physical therapy exercises helped restore some range of motion and reduce the constant pain that had become her companion. The nutritional recovery was perhaps the most visible transformation. Camp regulations required that prisoners of war receive rations equivalent to those provided to American-based troops, approximately 3,500 calories per day for men and 2,800 for women performing labor. For Hannelore, whose body had been surviving in perhaps 800 to 1,000 calories daily during her time at Stutthof, this abundance of food was almost overwhelming. In the first 2 weeks, she struggled to eat more than small portions, her stomach having shrunk to accommodate starvation, her digestive system no longer accustomed to processing adequate nutrition. But gradually, meal by meal, her body remembered what it meant to be fed, and the hollow cheeks began to fill out. The visible ribs began to disappear beneath returning flesh, and the constant exhaustion that had marked her movements began to lift. Leland visited her regularly during this period, conducting follow-up examinations that were partly medical necessity and partly something else, something harder to name. He found himself thinking about her case during his off hours, wondering how she was sleeping, whether the nightmares that she had mentioned in passing were becoming less, whether the trust that seemed to be slowly building between them was real, or merely the temporary gratitude of a patient toward a caretaker. By January 1945, 3 months after her arrival at Camp Forest, Hannelore had gained nearly 20 pounds, and her physical wounds had mostly healed, leaving scars that would never fully fade, but that no longer carried the immediate danger of infection or further damage. She had begun to participate in the daily routines of camp life, working in the laundry facility alongside other female prisoners, attending the educational programs that the camp offered, and slowly, Cautious Seidel, forming connections with women who had experienced similar traumas and who understood without explanation what she had survived. It was during a routine examination in late January that Hannelore asked Leland a question that stopped him completely, that made him set down his stethoscope and look at her, with an attention that went beyond the medical, that engaged him as a human being rather than simply as a healthcare provider. "Why do you care so much?" she asked in German, her language skills having improved enough that she could now form complex questions, could now express thoughts that went beyond simple answers to simple questions. "I was your enemy. My country tried to destroy yours. I served the people who killed your soldiers. Why do you treat me like I matter?" Leland sat down on the small stool in the examination room, bringing himself to her eye level, removing the physical hierarchy that usually existed between standing doctor and seated patient. He considered her question carefully because he understood that she was not asking out of mere curiosity, that this question carried within it the weight of everything she had experienced, all the dehumanization and cruelty and violence that had taught her that she did not matter, that her suffering was insignificant, that her life had no value beyond what labor could be extracted from her body. "Because you are a human being," Leland said finally, speaking slowly so that his German would be clear, "and because what was done to you was wrong. It does not matter what uniform you wore or what country you served. No person deserves to be tortured. No person deserves to be starved. No person deserves to have their body used as a place for others to express their cruelty." Hannelore listened to his words with an intensity that suggested she was not merely hearing them, but testing them, weighing them against everything she had learned about the world, trying to determine whether they could possibly be true. "But I am German," she said. "Your newspapers say we are all monsters. Your propaganda says we deserve to suffer for what our leaders have done." Leland shook his head. "You are not responsible for the crimes of your government. You are a young woman who was caught in a terrible war and who was hurt by people who had power over you. My job is to heal you. My choice is to see you as a person. These are not things I do despite you being German. These are things I do because you are human." Something shifted in Hannelore's expression then. Something subtle, but profound, like a wall that had stood for years finally beginning to crumble. Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time since Leland had met her, she allowed them to fall without shame, allowed herself to cry openly in the presence of another person, allowed the grief and trauma and accumulated suffering to pour out of her in sobs that shook her thin shoulders. Leland did not try to stop her tears or offer empty comfort. He simply sat with her, present and patient, bearing witness to her pain, understanding that this release was itself a form of healing that no medication could provide. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and in the months that followed, the machinery of imprisonment began to reverse itself. Prisoners who had been held for years started receiving notices of repatriation, processing dates, transport schedules that would carry them back across the Atlantic to a Germany that had been transformed into a landscape of rubble and occupation, divided among the victorious powers and struggling to rebuild from the ashes of total defeat. For the women at Camp Forest, this news brought mixed emotions. Some were eager to return home, to search for surviving family members, to begin the work of reconstructing their lives. Others feared what they would find, understood that the homes they remembered might no longer exist, that the people they loved might be dead or scattered, that the country they returned to would be utterly foreign, despite its familiar name. Hannelore received her repatriation notice in August 1945, informing her that she would be transported to New York and then shipped to the British occupation zone in northern Germany, where she would be released to civilian authorities and allowed to make her way to whatever remained of her former life. She brought the notice to Leland during one of their regular meetings, now held not in the examination room, but in the small garden behind the medical facilities where they had. begun taking walks together during his break periods. Leland read the notice and felt something complicated move through his chest, a mixture of relief that she would be free and sorrow that she would be gone, a recognition that the connection they had built over these months would soon be severed by an ocean and by the vastly different futures that awaited them. He had grown attached to her in ways that troubled him professionally, but that he could not deny personally. She had become more than a patient. She had become a testament to the possibility of healing, a living proof that even the most damaged person could find their way back toward wholeness when treated with consistent compassion. "I have something for you," Leland said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small notebook that he had been carrying with him for several weeks, waiting for the right moment to give it to her. The notebook was ordinary, the kind that could be purchased at any general store, with a brown cover and lined pages inside. But what made it extraordinary was what Leland had written within it over many late nights in his barracks, working by lamplight with his German dictionary beside him, composing sentences that he hoped would carry meaning beyond their simple words. Hannelore took the notebook and opened it carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. Inside, in Leland's careful handwriting, were pages of German text, sometimes grammatically imperfect but always clear in intention. He had written words of encouragement, reminding her of how far she had come, how much she had survived, how strong she had proven herself to be. He had written practical information, names of doctors in Germany who might help with her shoulder, addresses of relief organizations that were providing assistance to returning refugees, and he had written something else, something more personal, an acknowledgement of what their time together had meant to him, a hope that she would find peace and happiness in whatever life awaited her. According to historical records, approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States during World War II, housed in more than 700 camps across the country. The treatment of these prisoners varied considerably, but the official policy established by the War Department emphasized humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and many former prisoners would later describe their night in American captivity as surprisingly decent, sometimes even transformative. The medical care provided at camps like Camp Forest represented America at its best, a nation capable of extending compassion even to those who had served enemy regimes. Hannelore read through the notebook slowly, her lips moving slightly as she worked through Leland's German, tears streaming down her face, but a smile forming at the corners of her mouth. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression that contained gratitude beyond what words could capture, an acknowledgement that he had given her something more valuable than medicine or treatment, that he had given her back a belief in human kindness that the camps had nearly destroyed. "I will never forget you," she said simply. "You showed me that not everyone with power uses it to hurt. You showed me that healing is possible. You saved my life, not just my body." Leland walked her to the transport truck on the morning of her departure, standing among the other medical staff who had gathered to say goodbye to patients who had become, in some strange way, part of their extended family. As Hannelore climbed into the truck, she turned back one final time and raised her hand in a small wave, and Leland raised his in return, holding the gesture until the truck disappeared down the dusty road and out of sight. He never heard from her again. Letters sent to the addresses he had were returned undelivered. The chaos of post-war Germany swallowed millions of people into uncertainty, and Hannelore became one more name among countless others whose ultimate fate remained unknown. But Leland carried her memory with him for the rest of his life, through his return to civilian medicine in Virginia, through decades of practice as a country doctor like his father before him, through every patient he ever treated with the particular gentleness that he had learned was necessary when confronting hidden trauma. Her question echoed in his mind across the years. "Why do you care?" And his answer remained the same, spoken silently to every suffering person who sat before him. "Because you are human. Because your pain matters. Because compassion is the only response to cruelty that does not perpetuate it. In the end, the greatest weapon against dehumanization was simply the stubborn insistence on seeing each person as fully human, worthy of care, worthy of healing, worthy of hope. The story of Leland Carraway and Hannelore Seidel represents something essential about the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. In the camps of Nazi Germany, ordinary people committed extraordinary violence against those they had been taught to see as less than human. But in the examination rooms of Camp Forest, Tennessee, ordinary people demonstrated that healing could cross the boundaries of nationality and ideology, that mercy could be extended even to former enemies, and that the simple act of treating someone's wounds with care could restore something that brutality had tried to destroy. This was not propaganda. This was daily life. And it reminds us that the choice between cruelty and compassion is made not once but continuously, in every encounter with another person's suffering.